Melanie Carter was a woman who carried herself with quiet dignity, an air of confidence that came from years of fighting for her place in a world that often seemed determined to keep her down. She was in her early 30s, a single mother with a sharp mind and an unyielding spirit. Her days were a delicate balancing act between running a small but growing spice business and raising her 1-year-old son, Elijah. Despite the challenges, she thrived, refusing to let anyone or anything dictate her worth. Today was one of those rare moments when Melanie allowed herself a small luxury, a brief break from the chaos of work and motherhood. She decided to visit one of the trendier coffee shops in the city, known for its artisanal blends and vibrant atmosphere. Elijah, snug in his baby carrier strapped to Melanie's chest, cooed softly as they entered the cafe. The smell of freshly brewed coffee, mixed with the hum of quiet conversations and the faint tapping of laptop keys, created a soothing ambience. Melanie smiled to herself, relishing the simple pleasure of being in a space where, for once, she wasn't being pulled in a dozen different directions. She ordered a flat white and a warm croissant, her eyes briefly scanning the room as she waited at the counter. The cafe was a mix of people, students poring over textbooks, professionals taking meetings over laptops, and a few families with children. It felt safe, a little oasis in the bustling city. But Melanie was always aware of her surroundings. She had learned to be. Years of experience had taught her that even in spaces like this, she could never completely relax. She was used to the subtle stares, the whispered judgments, the feeling of being out of place despite doing nothing to deserve it. Today, however, she pushed those thoughts aside. This was her moment of peace. Just as she settled at a corner table, balancing Elijah's bottle in one hand and her coffee in the other, the cafe door swung open with a sharp jingle. Officer Craig Warren stepped inside, his heavy boots thudding against the polished wooden floor. He was in his mid-30s, his uniform crisp but his demeanor anything but. There was an edge to him, a simmering frustration that seemed to radiate off his broad frame. Warren had just come off a tense interaction during his shift, one that had left him seething. He felt undervalued, overlooked, and disrespected, emotions that had been building for months as his career stagnated. Spotting Melanie with her child, his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Warren's gaze lingered on her for a moment too long, his internal biases flickering to life. A young black woman with a baby, sitting confidently in a space he subconsciously deemed out of her reach, was enough to sour his mood further. He ordered a black coffee, his voice curt as he addressed the barista, and then took a seat near Melanie, his presence looming like a dark cloud. Melanie noticed him but gave no reaction. She had encountered men like him before, men who carried their power like a weapon, using it to intimidate rather than protect. She kept her focus on Elijah, adjusting his blanket as he fussed softly. But Warren wasn't the type to be ignored. He shifted in his chair, the scrape of wood against the floor breaking the comfortable hum of the cafe. "You should keep that kid quiet," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. Melanie looked up, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. "He's just a baby," she replied evenly, her tone neither defensive nor apologetic. "Babies make noise." Her response, simple and composed, was enough to send a ripple of tension through the room. A few patrons glanced their way, sensing the brewing conflict. Warren leaned back in his chair, his coffee untouched. "Kids like that shouldn't be in places like this," he muttered, not quite to himself but not directly to her either. The insinuation hung in the air, heavy and cutting. Melanie felt the familiar sting of such comments, the way they were designed to belittle without ever crossing the line into outright hostility. She took a sip of her coffee, refusing to engage further. Elijah's soft gurgles seemed to mock the officer's words, a reminder of the innocence he was so quick to condemn. For a moment it seemed the tension might dissipate. Warren's phone buzzed, drawing his attention, and Melanie returned to feeding Elijah. But then, as if unable to let it go, Warren stood up and approached her table. His presence was oppressive, his shadow falling over her like a challenge. "You think you're better than everyone else in here?" he asked, his voice low but laced with venom. "Sitting there, acting like you belong." Melanie looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "I don't act like I belong," she said, her voice steady. "I do belong." Warren scoffed, shaking his head. "People like you always think they can just walk in and take up space, don't you? Like the rules don't apply." His words were deliberate now, meant to provoke. Melanie's jaw tightened, but she remained seated, her hands gently rocking Elijah, who had begun to doze off. "I'm not breaking any rules, officer," she said. "I'm just having coffee with my son." The room had grown noticeably quieter, the usual clatter of cups and conversation subdued as patrons watched the interaction unfold. The barista behind the counter hesitated, her hands frozen mid-motion as she debated whether to intervene. But Melanie didn't need saving. She had faced worse than this. "If you're done," she added, her tone firm, "I'd like to finish my coffee." Warren's face darkened. He wasn't used to being dismissed, especially not by someone he had already decided didn't deserve his respect. Without thinking, he reached for the coffee cup on her table, lifting it with an air of authority. "Careful," he said mockingly, tilting the cup just enough for the liquid to threaten spilling. "Wouldn't want this to ruin your day." Melanie's eyes locked onto his, her gaze unwavering. "You're right," she said softly, her voice carrying an edge that cut through the tension like a blade. "You wouldn't want to ruin mine." For a moment, the two of them stood locked in a silent standoff, the room holding its collective breath. Warren set the cup back down with a little more force than necessary, the coffee sloshing dangerously close to the rim. He turned and walked away, his steps heavy with frustration, leaving Melanie to her thoughts. She exhaled slowly, her fingers brushing against Elijah's tiny hand. The confrontation wasn't over. She could feel it, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. But Melanie wasn't afraid. She had weathered storms before, and she would weather this one too. The cafe, once filled with the comforting hum of casual conversation and the soft whir of coffee machines, had fallen into an uneasy stillness. Melanie remained at her table, her expression calm, though her mind was already calculating her next move. She had encountered men like Officer Warren before, men who thought their authority gave them the right to intimidate, belittle, and control. She knew the confrontation wasn't over. People like him didn't back down quietly. They didn't just walk away. Warren hovered near the counter, sipping his coffee with exaggerated nonchalance, but his eyes never left her. His frustration had reached a boiling point, though he masked it poorly behind a thin veneer of professionalism. He glanced around the cafe, as if seeking validation from the other patrons, but most of them avoided his gaze. They had seen enough to know this was a moment they didn't want to involve themselves in. Still, Melanie could feel their silent tension, their collective unease as they watched and waited to see what would happen next. Elijah stirred in his carrier, his tiny fingers grasping at the air as he let out a soft cry. Melanie adjusted the blanket around him, whispering soothing words until he settled again. The movement drew Warren's attention like a magnet. He set his cup down on the counter with a sharp clink, his jaw tightening as he stalked back toward her table. The weight of his presence was suffocating, and the room seemed to shrink as he loomed over her once again. "You think you're smart, don't you?" he said, his voice low and pointed, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Sitting here like you're untouchable." Like you can just ignore me." Melanie looked up at him, her expression as steady as her voice when she replied, "I'm not ignoring you, officer. I just don't see the need to entertain your hostility." Her words were carefully chosen, calm but firm, designed to diffuse the situation without conceding any ground. But Warren wasn't looking for peace. He wanted control. He wanted her to cower, to apologize, to submit to the authority he so desperately clung to. "You've got a lot of nerve," he said, his hand twitching at his side, as if resisting the urge to reach for something, a weapon, a prop, anything to assert his dominance. "You think just because you're sitting here with a baby you're above the rules? That you're special?" Melanie's gaze didn't waver. "What rules am I breaking, officer? Drinking coffee? Feeding my child? Existing in a public space?" Her calmness infuriated him. He took a step closer, leaning over the table, his shadow swallowing the light that had once danced on her coffee cup. "I could make this very difficult for you," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, though the threat in his words was deafening. Melanie leaned back slightly, her hand instinctively resting on Elijah's back, as if shielding him from the oppressive energy radiating from Warren. She knew better than to escalate the situation, but she also knew she couldn't allow him to intimidate her. Not here, not in front of her son. "I'm not looking for trouble, officer," she said evenly, "but I won't tolerate harassment either." The word hung in the air like a live wire, sparking a ripple of unease through the room. A couple at a nearby table exchanged nervous glances. The barista behind the counter shifted uncomfortably, her hands gripping the edge of the counter as if bracing herself. Warren's face darkened, his composure cracking as his ego absorbed the blow of her defiance. "Harassment," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "You think this is harassment? Lady, you don't know the meaning of the word." Before Melanie could respond, he reached for the coffee cup on her table again. This time, he didn't just tilt it, he grabbed it outright and poured its steaming contents onto the floor beside her chair. The liquid splashed dangerously close to her shoes, the heat radiating upward in a brief but sharp wave. The cafe erupted into a shocked silence. Someone near the back let out a soft gasp, and a few people instinctively pulled out their phones, though none dared to lift them high enough to record openly. Melanie's breath caught in her throat, not from fear but from the sheer audacity of his actions. She glanced down at the spilled coffee, her jaw tightening as she slowly looked back up at Warren. "Was that supposed to scare me?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with a steel edge that cut through the tension like a blade. Warren smirked, crossing his arms over his chest as he leaned back slightly, as if satisfied with his display of power. "Maybe it was a reminder," he said. "You're not in charge here." Melanie's eyes narrowed, but she didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she reached for a napkin and calmly wiped the edge of the table where a few stray drops of coffee had landed. Her deliberate composure only seemed to aggravate him further. "You're not going to get away with this," he said, his smirk fading as his tone grew harsher. "You think you can just sit there, act like you're untouchable, and nothing will happen? People like you always think they're above the law." Melanie finally stood, her movements slow and deliberate as she adjusted Elijah's carrier. She met Warren's gaze head-on, her voice firm but devoid of anger. "And people like you," she said, "always think the law is a weapon to wield against those you don't respect." The words hit him like a slap, though he tried to mask his reaction with a sneer. "You don't know who you're messing with," he said, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I could have you out of here in handcuffs before you even know what's happening." Melanie tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "You're welcome to try," she said softly, the challenge in her tone unmistakable. For a moment it seemed Warren might actually act on his threat. His hand twitched again, his eyes darting around the room as if calculating his next move. But then he froze, his gaze locking onto something or someone behind Melanie. His face flickered with a brief flash of uncertainty before he quickly masked it with his usual bravado. Melanie didn't need to turn around to know what or who had caught his attention. She could feel the shift in the room, the subtle but palpable change in the atmosphere. Whatever advantage Warren thought he had, it was slipping away, and he knew it. Still, he wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. He straightened his posture, his jaw set as he glared at Melanie. "You're going to regret this," he said, his voice low and venomous. Melanie didn't flinch. She adjusted Elijah's blanket one last time before stepping around the spilled coffee, her movements calm and purposeful as she began to walk toward the door. She paused briefly, turning back to look at Warren with a gaze so steady it made him visibly bristle. "Maybe," she said, her voice cool and measured, "but not as much as you will." With that, she walked out, leaving Warren standing in the center of the cafe, his anger boiling over into the space she had so effortlessly dismantled. Melanie stepped outside into the crisp air, her heart pounding as she adjusted Elijah in his carrier. The confrontation with Officer Warren had left her nerves taut, but she refused to let it show. Every instinct told her that the situation wasn't over. Men like Warren didn't let things go, especially when their ego had been bruised in public. The quiet determination in his eyes before she exited the cafe made it clear that he would escalate this, one way or another. She walked calmly down the street, each step deliberate and measured, as though she weren't carrying the weight of the morning's confrontation on her shoulders. Elijah cooed softly, blissfully unaware of the tension that still hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Melanie glanced briefly at her reflection in a shop window, noting the firm set of her jaw and the calm focus in her eyes. She had faced worse than this before, and she reminded herself that she was prepared for whatever came next. Behind her, the door of the cafe swung open with a sharp clang. Melanie didn't need to look back to know who had emerged. She could feel the weight of Warren's gaze boring into her back, the predatory energy of a man who refused to let his perceived authority be challenged. His footsteps were heavy and deliberate as he followed her, his boots striking the pavement like gunshots in the stillness of the morning. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Warren's voice carried down the street, sharp and cutting, breaking through the quiet. Melanie didn't stop walking, but she slowed her pace slightly, keeping her head high as she responded without turning around. "I don't know what you're talking about, officer," she said evenly, her tone devoid of emotion. "Oh, you know exactly what I'm talking about," he shot back, quickening his pace until he was only a few steps behind her. "You think you can just walk away after that little stunt back there? Act like nothing happened." Melanie stopped abruptly, turning to face him with an expression of composed defiance. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice calm but firm. "If you're still upset about your coffee, officer, I suggest you let it go." Warren's jaw tightened, his face darkening as he took a step closer. His uniform seemed to grow heavier on him, a symbol of power that he was desperate to reassert. "Let it go," he echoed, his voice rising slightly. "You've got a lot of nerve talking to me like that. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" Melanie's eyes didn't waver. "I'm dealing with a man who seems to think his badge gives him the right to intimidate people," she said, her tone cutting through the air like a blade. "But I'm not intimidated, officer. Not by you." Her words hit him like a slap, and for a moment he seemed at a loss for how to respond. His hand twitched at his side, as though he was debating whether to reach for something: his radio, his handcuffs, or perhaps his pride. Around them, a few passers-by had stopped to watch the unfolding scene, their expressions ranging from curiosity to unease. Melanie could feel their eyes on her, but she remained focused on Warren, refusing to let him see even a flicker of doubt in her. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" Warren said finally, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can just walk around, acting like the rules don't apply to you?" "I think you're making a scene," Melanie replied coolly. "And I think it's time you walked away before you embarrass yourself any further." That was the breaking point. Warren's composure shattered, and he took another step forward, his hand reaching for her arm. Before Melanie could react, he grabbed her wrist with a grip that was both firm and possessive, as though he believed he could physically assert his control over her. "Enough," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You're coming with me." Melanie's eyes flashed with anger, but she kept her voice steady. "Let go of me, officer," she said. "You have no right to detain me." "I don't need a reason," Warren snapped, his grip tightening. "I've had enough of your attitude, and I'm not going to stand here and let you disrespect me." A small crowd was beginning to gather now, their murmurs of concern growing louder as they watched the scene unfold. One man stepped forward hesitantly, his phone in hand, but Warren shot him a glare that froze him in place. Melanie took a deep breath, her mind racing as she weighed her options. She knew that any sudden movement could escalate the situation further, but she also knew she couldn't let Warren continue to manhandle her without consequence. "Officer," she said calmly, meeting his eyes with an unwavering gaze, "you're making a mistake." "Oh, I don't think so," he sneered, his face inches from hers. "The only mistake here is you thinking you could get away with disrespecting me." Before Melanie could respond, Elijah let out a sudden wail, his tiny voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The sound seemed to startle Warren, his grip loosening slightly as he glanced down at the baby carrier. Melanie seized the moment, pulling her wrist free with a quick, fluid motion and taking a step back. "Leave my son out of this," she said, her voice sharp with a protective edge. Warren's face twisted with frustration, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He looked as though he was on the verge of exploding, but before he could make another move, a voice rang out from the crowd. "Is there a problem here?" Both Melanie and Warren turned to see a tall man in a tailored suit supping forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. His expression was calm but authoritative, and there was something about the way he carried himself that suggested he wasn't someone to be trifled with. "This is none of your business," Warren barked, his frustration spilling over as he turned his ire on the newcomer. "Actually, it is my business," the man said evenly, his gaze shifting to Melanie. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Melanie nodded, her eyes flicking briefly to Warren before returning to the man in the suit. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady. "Thank you." The man turned his attention back to Warren, his expression hardening. "Officer, I suggest you step back and reconsider your actions before this situation escalates further." Warren bristled, his face flushing with anger. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he demanded. The man didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced a sleek black wallet, flipping it open to reveal a badge. "Special Agent Harris," he said, his tone cold and precise. "Department of Justice." The color drained from Warren's face as he stared at the badge, his bravado faltering for the first time. The crowd murmured in surprise, their attention now fully focused on the unfolding drama. Melanie felt a flicker of relief, though she remained cautious, knowing that the situation could still take an unpredictable turn. "This woman has done nothing wrong," Agent Harris continued, his voice firm. "And unless you'd like to explain your actions to my superiors, I suggest you let her go and walk away." For a moment it seemed as though Warren might argue, his pride warring with the reality of the situation. But finally he took a step back, his jaw clenched as he glared at Melanie one last time. "This isn't over," he muttered before turning and stalking away, his boots striking the pavement with angry force. Agent Harris watched him go, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to Melanie, his demeanor softening slightly. "Are you sure you're all right?" he asked. Melanie nodded, adjusting Elijah's blanket as she met his gaze. "I'm fine," she said. "Thank you for stepping in." The agent gave a small nod, his eyes lingering on her for a moment before he slipped his badge back into his pocket. "Be careful," he said simply before turning and disappearing into the crowd. As the onlookers began to disperse, Melanie took a deep breath, her heart finally beginning to slow. She knew this wasn't the end of the ordeal. Warren's parting words made that clear, but for now, she was safe. And she was ready for whatever came next. Melanie continued down the bustling street, her mind racing despite the calm expression she maintained. Elijah had finally drifted back to sleep in his carrier, the rhythmic sway of her steps soothing him after the earlier tension. But the weight of what had just happened lingered heavily on her shoulders. Officer Warren wasn't the kind of man to simply walk away and let his ego take the hit. Men like him, she knew, thrived on intimidation and control, and the thought of her defiance would likely fester in his mind until it erupted into something worse. She turned the corner and entered a quieter part of the neighborhood. Rows of small businesses lined the street, boutiques, cafes and specialty shops with colorful awnings and cheerful displays in the windows. It was a place she often frequented, where people recognized her and treated her with kindness. But today, even this familiar setting felt charged with unease. Melanie quickened her pace, heading toward a small storefront with a faded sign that read Heritage Spices Goods. This was her space, her sanctuary, and she needed its walls around her now more than ever. The bell above the door chimed softly as she stepped inside. The air was warm and fragrant, filled with the rich aromas of cinnamon, cardamom, and dried herbs that lined the shelves in neatly labeled glass jars. The shop was empty, save for her assistant, Mia, a young woman with an easy smile and a sharp mind who had been working with Melanie since the business had launched. Mia looked up from the counter where she was organizing receipts and immediately noticed the tension in Melanie's posture. "Hey, everything okay?" Mia asked, her brow furrowing as she set down the papers. Melanie gave a small nod, adjusting the carrier on her chest as she moved toward the counter. "It's fine now," she said, her voice steady but tired. "Just had a run-in with someone who didn't know when to back off." Mia's expression darkened slightly. "Do you need me to call someone? What happened?" Melanie shook her head, offering a faint smile to reassure her. "No need. It's handled for now. But keep an eye out, just in case." She set down her bag and pulled Elijah's blanket tighter around him, brushing a hand over his soft curls as he slept. "I'll tell you more later." Mia nodded, though the concern in her eyes didn't fade. She was used to Melanie's self-sufficiency, her ability to handle things with grace and resolve, but there was something about the way Melanie carried herself today that felt different. There was an edge to her calmness, a tension that suggested this wasn't just a passing incident. Melanie moved behind the counter and busied herself with inventory, trying to distract her mind from the lingering unease. But it was no use. She could still feel Warren's gaze on her, the weight of his threats hanging in the air like a storm cloud. She had stood her ground. Yes, but she knew better than to assume that would be the end of it. Warren wasn't the type to let go of a grudge, especially one that made him look weak in front of an audience. Her instincts were proven right not an hour later when the bell over the door rang again, this time with an urgency that sent a chill down her spine. She looked up to see Warren stepping into the shop, his uniform still crisp but his demeanor anything but. His eyes swept the room, taking in the shelves of spices and jars before landing on her with a look of thinly veiled contempt. The tension in the room was immediate and suffocating. Mia froze behind the counter, her hand hovering over the cash register as her eyes darted to Melanie for guidance. Melanie straightened, her heart pounding but her expression calm as she stepped forward to meet Warren's gaze. "Can I help you, officer?" she asked, her voice steady and polite. Warren's lips twisted into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "Nice little setup you've got here," he said, his tone casual but dripping with disdain. "He didn't take you for the entrepreneurial type." Melanie didn't flinch. "What can I do for you?" she repeated, refusing to rise to his bait. Warren took a step closer, his boots heavy against the polished wood floor. "I thought I made myself clear earlier," he said, his voice lowering slightly. "You don't get to walk away from me like that." Mia glanced nervously between them, her hand inching toward her phone, but Melanie gave her a subtle shake of the head. This wasn't the time for panic. She needed to handle this carefully to keep Warren's attention focused solely on her. "I'm not sure what you mean," Melanie said, tilting her head slightly as though she were genuinely confused. "Is there something specific you need, officer?" Warren's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of irritation. He stepped closer, close enough that Melanie could smell the faint trace of coffee on his breath. "You've got a smart mouth, you know that," he said. "People like you always do. Think you're better than everyone else. Think the rules don't apply." Melanie held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "If you're not here to make a purchase, officer, I'm going to have to ask you to leave," she said firmly. Warren's eyes narrowed, and for a moment she thought he might actually lash out. But then he took a step back, his posture shifting as though he were trying to regain control of the situation. "You think this is over?" he asked, his voice low and venomous. "You've got no idea who you're dealing with." Melanie's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She watched as Warren turned and walked to the door, his hand lingering on the handle for a moment before he pushed it open and stepped out into the street. The bell chimed softly as the door swung shut behind him, leaving the shop in an uneasy silence. Mia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "What the hell was that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Melanie shook her head, her shoulders relaxing just enough to let out a sigh. "Trouble," she said simply. "The kind that doesn't go away quietly." Mia hesitated, then reached for her phone. "Should we call someone? The police?" Melanie gave a bitter laugh, though there was no humor in it. "He is the police," she said, "and that's the problem." For the next hour, Melanie kept herself busy, her hands moving through the motions of restocking shelves and updating inventory, but her mind was elsewhere. She knew Warren wasn't done with her, and the longer he stayed out of sight, the more dangerous he became. She needed to be ready for whatever came next, and she needed to protect not just herself, but Elijah and the business she had worked so hard to build. As evening approached, she locked the shop's doors and prepared to head home. She adjusted Elijah in his carrier, his soft breathing a reminder of what was truly at stake. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for him, for the life she wanted him to have, free from fear and intimidation. But as she stepped outside, she couldn't shake the feeling that Warren was still watching, still waiting for his moment to strike. And she knew, deep down, that this was far from over. The streets were quieter now as Melanie made her way home. The golden hues of the setting sun cast long shadows over the sidewalk, and a cool breeze whispered through the city, carrying with it a deceptive sense of calm. Elijah, still strapped securely to her chest, slept peacefully, his small breaths warm against her collarbone. But Melanie's mind was anything but peaceful. The encounter with Officer Warren lingered, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. His parting words had been clear, a promise of trouble to come. And Melanie knew men like Warren didn't bluff. They escalated. They pushed. And they sought to reassert their power at all costs. As she approached her apartment building, Melanie glanced over her shoulder. The street behind her was mostly empty, save for a few scattered pedestrians and parked cars. Still, the faint prickle of unease at the nape of her neck wouldn't dissipate. She shifted Elijah slightly, the motion as much to soothe herself as to adjust his weight. Her instincts, honed through years of navigating subtle and overt threats, screamed that she wasn't alone. Reaching the building's entrance, she quickly punched in her code and stepped inside, the heavy door closing with a satisfying click behind her. The lobby was quiet, the usual hum of residents returning from work or heading out for the evening absent. The stillness was unnerving. Melanie tightened her grip on her bag and took the stairs to her apartment instead of the elevator, her senses on high alert. Once inside her apartment, she locked the door and slid the chain into place. She exhaled slowly, a momentary reprieve from the tension that had followed her all day. Placing Elijah gently in his crib, she took a moment to watch him, her heart aching with a mix of love and protectiveness. Whatever was coming, she promised herself she would face it head-on for him. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her attention. Melanie frowned as she picked it up. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was local. Against her better judgment, she answered. "Hello?" There was a brief pause before a voice she recognized all too well came through the line. "You thought you could just walk away, didn't you?" Melanie's grip on the phone tightened. "Officer Warren," she said evenly, masking the anger bubbling beneath her calm tone. "This is harassment." "You want to talk about harassment?" he snapped. "Let me tell you something. People like you don't get to disrespect people like me and walk away unscathed." Melanie's pulse quickened, but her voice remained steady. "If you're calling to make threats, I suggest you think very carefully about what you're saying. This call is being recorded." A bitter laugh crackled through the line. "You think that scares me? You think anyone's going to believe you over me? You're playing a dangerous game, lady." The call ended abruptly, leaving Melanie staring at her phone in frustration and disbelief. She quickly saved the number and made a note of the time, her mind racing. Warren was unhinged, and now he'd crossed the line into open threats. This wasn't just about his bruised ego anymore, it was personal. She set her phone down and moved to the kitchen, pulling open a drawer where she kept important documents. Among them was a folder containing legal resources and contacts she'd collected over the years, lawyers, advocacy groups, and even a few trusted journalists. She flipped through it, her fingers trembling slightly. Warren might think he was untouchable, but Melanie knew better. No one was above accountability, and she wasn't going to let him intimidate her into silence. The sound of tires screeching outside jolted her. Melanie froze, her heart pounding as she moved cautiously to the window. Peeking through the curtain, she saw a police cruiser idling on the curb. Its headlights cut through the dusk like twin daggers, and even from her vantage point, she could see the unmistakable silhouette of Warren in the driver's seat. He was watching her. Melanie's chest tightened as a surge of adrenaline coursed through her. This was no longer just a game of intimidation, it was a blatant abuse of power. She stepped away from the window, her mind racing through her options. Calling the police felt futile. Warren was the police, and any report would likely fall on deaf ears or worse, escalate the situation further. She needed to think strategically. Her first instinct was to call Mia. The young assistant had proven time and again to be resourceful and fiercely loyal. Melanie quickly dialed her number, keeping her voice low as the call connected. "Mia, it's me." "Melanie, what's wrong?" Mia's concern was immediate. "Warren's here," Melanie said, glancing toward the window again. "He's parked outside my building." "What?" Mia's voice rose, a mix of disbelief and anger. "What the hell is he doing there?" "Intimidation, most likely," Melanie replied. "But I need you to do something for me. Call Harris." "Harris? The toy guy?" "Yes," Melanie said firmly. "I need him to know what's happening. And if you can't reach him, call the legal team we worked with last year on the zoning issue. They'll know what to do." "Got it," Mia said without hesitation. "Are you safe?" "For now," Melanie said. "Just make the call. I'll handle the rest." As she ended the call, Melanie's mind shifted into overdrive. She couldn't let Warren's actions dictate her next move. She needed to stay ahead of him, to outmaneuver him before he could escalate further. The sudden knock at her door made her jump. It was sharp and insistent, each rap echoing through the apartment like a gunshot. Melanie's breath caught as she approached the door, her hand hovering over the chain. "Evs, Carter," Warren's voice called from the other side, deceptively calm. "I think we need to have a little chat." Melanie didn't respond. She stood frozen, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it through the door. "I know you're in there," he continued, his tone taking on a sharper edge. "Come on now. Let's not make this difficult." Melanie took a deep breath, forcing herself to think clearly. She couldn't let him in, but she also couldn't ignore him forever. Her eyes darted to her phone, and she quickly opened the recording app, pressing the button to start capturing audio. "I don't have anything to say to you, officer," she called back, keeping her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. "That's unfortunate," Warren replied, "because I have plenty to say to you." There was a pause, and Melanie heard the faint sound of footsteps retreating down the hall. She didn't dare open the door, but the tension in her body remained, every muscle coiled like a spring. She moved back to the window and peeked out again. The cruiser was still there, its engine idling, but Warren was gone. The sudden sound of her phone vibrating on the counter made her jump. She snatched it up and saw Mia's name on the screen. "I got through to Harris," Mia said quickly. "He's on his way, and he said to stay put. Don't engage." "Did you tell him about the call earlier?" Melanie asked. "Everything," Mia confirmed. "He said he's bringing backup." Melanie's grip on the phone tightened. Backup. That word alone brought a small measure of relief, but it also underscored just how serious the situation had become. For the next hour, Melanie stayed in her apartment, her ears tuned to every sound outside her door. When the knock finally came again, it wasn't sharp and menacing like Warren's had been. It was measured, deliberate. She checked the peephole and exhaled in relief when she saw Harris standing there, his suit crisp and his expression unreadable. "Evs, Carter," he said as she opened the door. "Are you all right?" "For now," she replied, stepping aside to let him in. "Warren's been circling me all evening. He even came to the door." Harris nodded, his jaw tightening. "We've got a team outside now. He won't get far." Melanie's shoulders sagged slightly as the weight of the day began to catch up with her. She gestured to the couch, and Harris took a seat, his gaze steady as he listened to her recount everything that had happened from the cafe to the phone call, to the cruiser parked outside her building. When she finished, Harris leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "This isn't the first time we've had complaints about Warren," he said grimly. "But this time he's crossed a line. We'll make sure he's held accountable." Melanie nodded, her resolve hardening. "Good," she said, "because I'm not letting this go." Neither was Harris. And as the night stretched on, Melanie realized that this fight was far from over, but for the first time she felt like she wasn't facing it alone. The sound of tires screeching outside jolted Melanie awake from her restless daze. She had spent hours pacing her apartment, checking the windows and listening for any hint of further intrusion. Elijah, mercifully oblivious to the turmoil, slept soundly in his crib. Melanie had long since lost track of time, her sense of calm worn thin by the looming presence of Officer Warren and the potential danger he represented. She moved quickly to the window, careful to stay out of sight, and peeked through the curtains. The street below was no longer quiet. Two unmarked black SUVs had pulled up behind Warren's cruiser, their sleek forms unmistakably official. Men in dark suits emerged, their movements sharp and purposeful, and Melanie instantly recognized Harris among them. He was speaking into a radio, his jaw set with grim determination. The sight gave her a flicker of relief, but it also reminded her that the situation was escalating rapidly. Whatever was about to happen, it was going to come to a head tonight. A sharp knock at her door made her heart jump. She froze for a moment, her breath catching in her throat, before carefully approaching. She looked through the peephole and saw Harris standing there, his expression calm but intense. Behind him stood another agent, his gaze sweeping the hallway with practiced vigilance. Melanie unlocked the door and opened it just enough to speak. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice low and measured. "We've secured the perimeter," Harris said, stepping closer. "Warren hasn't left the area. He's been circling the block, likely trying to decide his next move. But I need you to stay inside. This is about to get messy." Melanie nodded, her pulse quickening. "What are you planning to do?" Harris's expression didn't waver. "We're going to confront him. He's already crossed enough lines to warrant an investigation, and his behavior tonight confirms everything we've suspected. But I need you to trust me, Ms. Carter. Let us handle this." Melanie hesitated, glancing toward Elijah's crib. The thought of staying locked inside when chaos unfolded outside didn't sit well with her, but she also knew Harris was right. This wasn't her fight to lead anymore. She gave a short nod. "Fine, but you need to make sure he doesn't come near us again." Harris's gaze softened slightly. "That's the plan." He stepped back, motioning for the other agent to follow, and the door closed behind them with a heavy finality. Melanie locked it again, her fingers trembling slightly as she stepped away. The tension in the air was suffocating, and every fiber of her being was on edge, waiting for the inevitable. Minutes passed like hours as she paced the small living room, her ears straining to catch any sound from outside. When it finally came a raised voice, sharp and angry, her breath caught. She rushed to the window, her hands gripping the edges of the curtain as she peered out. Warren was standing in the middle of the street, his posture tense and aggressive. His cruiser was parked haphazardly, its lights flashing in defiance, and he was shouting at Harris and the other agents, who had approached him with calm but firm authority. Melanie couldn't make out the words, but Warren's body language said everything. He was cornered, furious and unwilling to back down. "You think you can just come after me?" Warren's voice echoed through the quiet night, carrying up to her window. "I've been on this force for 15 years. You don't have the authority to tell me what to do." Harris stood his ground, his hands raised in a gesture of non-aggression, but his voice carried the weight of someone who wasn't about to back down. "Officer Warren, this isn't a negotiation. Step away from the vehicle and hand over your badge. You've left us no choice." Warren laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and grating. "No choice. You're going to ruin my career over some mouthy woman who doesn't know her place. You think I'm just going to stand here and let that happen?" Melanie's stomach churned at his words, the venom in his voice cutting deep even from a distance. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay calm. This was Harris's fight now, and she had to trust him to see it through. But Warren wasn't done. He took a step forward, his hand hovering near his holster, and the agents around him tensed visibly. "You don't understand what it's like," he spat, his voice shaking with anger. "People like me, people who actually do the hard work, we're the ones who keep this city running. And people like you come in here and try to tear us down. Well, I'm not going down without a fight." "Warren," Harris said, his voice sharp but controlled, "you're making this worse for yourself. Don't do something you can't take back." For a moment it seemed like Warren might listen. His hand wavered, his gaze darting between Harris and the other agents. But then his eyes flicked upward, landing on Melanie's window, and his expression twisted into something darker. "She's watching, isn't she?" he growled. "She thinks she's won." Melanie's breath caught as Warren's gaze locked onto hers. The sheer malice in his eyes was enough to send a shiver down her spine. She stepped back instinctively, her heart racing as he pointed toward her window. "This isn't over," he shouted, his voice echoing through the street. "You hear me? This isn't." His words were cut off as Harris stepped forward, his tone cold and commanding. "Enough. Officer Warren, you're under arrest. Put your hands where I can see them." Warren hesitated for a split second before lunging toward his cruiser, his movements wild and desperate. The agents reacted instantly, closing in on him with practiced precision. There was a brief struggle, shouts, the sound of something heavy hitting metal, but it ended quickly. Warren was forced to the ground, his hands wrenched behind his back as handcuffs clicked into place. Melanie watched from the shadows of her apartment, her hands pressed to her mouth as the scene unfolded. Relief washed over her in waves, but it was tempered by a lingering unease. Even in defeat, Warren's final words echoed in her mind, a chilling reminder of his hatred and the lengths he had been willing to go. Harris straightened, his expression unreadable as he spoke into his radio. Warren was hauled to his feet, his face flushed with rage and humiliation, and led toward one of the black SUVs. As the door slammed shut behind him, the street fell eerily silent once more. Melanie let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she stepped away from the window. She moved to Elijah's crib, brushing her fingers over his soft curls as he stirred slightly in his sleep. The sight of him, so small and innocent, grounded her, reminding her of why she had stood her ground in the first place. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She hesitated for a moment before opening it, finding Harris standing there once again. His expression was softer now, the tension from earlier replaced by quiet resolve. "It's over," he said simply. Melanie nodded, though she knew better than to believe it was truly the end. Warren might be in custody, but the systems that had enabled him still loomed large. There was more work to be done, more battles to fight. But for tonight, she allowed herself a moment of relief, knowing she had faced the storm and come out on the other side. The quiet of the early morning settled over the city like a fragile truce. Melanie sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands. The events of the past day played over in her mind, vivid and unrelenting. Every detail from the confrontation at the cafe to the tense standoff outside her apartment felt like a chapter in a story she never wanted to live. But it was over now. At least, that's what Harris had said. Elijah stirred in his crib nearby, his soft coos breaking the silence. Melanie smiled faintly, setting down her tea and walking over to pick him up. He reached for her, his tiny fingers brushing against her face, and the weight of his innocence grounded her. She kissed his forehead, holding him close as she moved to the living room. The morning light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the walls. It was a new day, and with it came the promise of a fresh start. But Melanie knew better than to believe that all was resolved. Warren's threats still echoed in her ears, his venomous words a reminder of the systemic issues she had been fighting against for years. His arrest might have marked the end of one battle, but the war was far from over. Men like Warren were symptoms of a deeper sickness, one that couldn't be eradicated with a single act of accountability. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her from her thoughts. She hesitated before answering, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Harris's name on the screen. "Es Carter," Harris said when she picked up, his voice steady but serious. "I wanted to update you." Melanie adjusted Elijah in her arms, leaning against the kitchen counter. "Go ahead." "Warren's being processed as we speak," Harris continued. "He'll face multiple charges, including harassment and abuse of power. The evidence we've gathered, combined with your account and the recordings, makes the case against him airtight." Melanie exhaled slowly, a sense of relief washing over her. "That's good to hear," she said, though her tone was cautious. "But I have to ask what happens next. What about the others like him?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Melanie could almost hear Harris choosing his words carefully. "This isn't an isolated incident," he admitted. "Warren's behavior is part of a larger pattern we've been investigating for some time. His arrest is a step forward, but it's just the beginning. There's still a lot of work to do." Melanie nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I understand. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help." "You've already done more than most," Harris said. "Your courage in standing up to him is what made this possible. Don't underestimate the impact of that." After they ended the call, Melanie set her phone down and stared out the window. The city was waking up, the streets slowly filling with life as people went about their routines, unaware of the quiet battles being fought in their midst. She thought about Harris's words, about the role she had played in bringing Warren to justice. It was a victory, yes, but it didn't feel like enough. Later that morning, Melanie decided to take Elijah to the park. It was a sunny day, the kind that demanded to be enjoyed, despite the heaviness in her heart. She packed a small bag with snacks and toys and set out, the familiar rhythm of her footsteps on the pavement helping to ease her restless mind. The park was bustling with activity. Children ran through the grass, their laughter ringing out like a balm against the tension she still carried. Parents chatted on benches, their voices blending into the hum of the city. Melanie found a quiet spot under a tree and spread out a blanket, setting Elijah down with his favorite stuffed animal. He giggled as he grabbed at the grass, his tiny hands exploring the world with wide-eyed wonder. As she watched him play, Melanie's thoughts drifted back to the events of the previous day. She thought about the bystanders in the cafe, the way they had frozen in the face of Warren's aggression. She couldn't blame them. Confronting someone like him wasn't easy, but it reminded her of the importance of speaking up, of standing together against injustice. Silence only allowed people like Warren to thrive. Melanie pulled out her phone and opened her notes app. She began to write, her fingers flying across the screen as the words poured out of her. It wasn't just about documenting her experience, it was about creating a record, a roadmap for others who might face similar challenges. She detailed every moment, every decision she had made, and the emotions that had fueled her resolve. By the time she finished, the sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park. A notification pinged on her phone. It was an email from a local community group she had worked with in the past. They were organizing a town hall meeting to discuss police accountability and systemic reform. Melanie's heart quickened as she read the details, and without hesitation, she replied, offering to share her story and help lead the discussion. In the days that followed, Melanie threw herself into the work. She met with activists, spoke at events, and collaborated with Harris to ensure that Warren's case would set a precedent for holding officers accountable. The attention her story garnered brought both support and criticism, but Melanie refused to be deterred. She knew that change didn't come easily, and she was prepared to face the challenges head-on. One evening, after putting Elijah to bed, Melanie sat down at her desk and opened her laptop. She pulled up the folder of contacts she had built over the years: lawyers, journalists, community leaders, and began drafting an email. Her fingers hesitated for a moment as she considered what to say, but then the words came easily. "Dear friends," she began. "Recent events have reminded me of the strength we have when we stand together. There is so much work to be done, and I believe we can make a real difference if we continue to push for change. I'm reaching out to ask for your support in a new initiative." By the time she finished, her vision for the future felt clearer than ever. She hit send and leaned back in her chair, exhaustion tugging at her but satisfaction warming her chest. This wasn't the end of her journey, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one that she would face with the same determination that had carried her through everything else. As she turned off the lights and made her way to bed, Melanie paused by Elijah's crib. She watched him sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath. She reached down and brushed a hand over his curls, her heart swelling with love and resolve. "This is for you," she whispered, "and for everyone who deserves better." The city outside was still and quiet, but Melanie knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Change was coming, and she was ready to lead it.